Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome a new friend of mine, Patrick T. Brown. He is the co-director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Breakthrough Institute. Patrick, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I had your colleague, Seaver Wang, on the podcast. He is the other co-director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Breakthrough Institute. I didn't warn you. I might have warned Seaver, but this is the ambush just as getting started here, Patrick. Guests on this podcast introduce themselves. So imagine you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, and you have about 60 seconds to tell us who you are. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Patrick Brown. I'm co-director of the Climate and Energy team at the Breakthrough Institute. I'm a meteorologist and climate scientist. I'm from Minnesota. I went to the University of Wisconsin in their Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences, so kind of a meteorology undergrad major. Then I got a master's degree in meteorology and climate science from San Jose State University. So moved out to California. Then I went to North Carolina, where I got a PhD at Duke in Earth and Ocean Sciences. Then back out to California, did a postdoc at the Carnegie Institution at Stanford. And I was briefly a professor at San Jose State. And so I've been teaching and doing research on climate for over a decade now as a professor, and then now at the Breakthrough Institute.
Well, so I want to get into your recent paper that you published in Nature about climate and wildfires, and also the September 5th piece you published on the Free Press. But one of the questions I wrote down, since you've given us your background, and you're living in North Carolina right now, and outside Raleigh in Cary, North Carolina. So you clearly climate stuff has been your bag. So can I say that? Climate science has been your bag for a long time now. What out of high school you chose this? Why climate science? Why did you decide to become a climate guy?
I guess I've always just been interested in the weather and severe weather. So even when I was like 8 years old, I had a weather station on top of my roof, and I had a newsletter that I sent out to the family, and I would record forecasts on my voicemail. And so it's just always been.
So, and this was where in Minnesota that you did this?
I grew up in Minnetonka, Minnesota.
Uh-huh. And so what was the lowest temperature you recorded then? Do you remember that? When it's cold up there.
It would, wind chills would be, 40, 50 below Fahrenheit sometimes. And we would have, many days in a row of below zero high temperatures. And it doesn't snow all that much in Minnesota compared to the West or parts of the Northeast. And so you don't get snow days very often where there's good snow plows, but you would get cold days because, they'd be worried about kids literally freezing to death at the bus stop. So yeah, it was quite cold. And that was an interest as well. But I was particularly interested in tornadoes and thunderstorms, and so the severe weather in the summer.
This is from age 8, you said?
Yeah. So
when
I applied to undergrad,
you knew the types of clouds from when you were, before you were even a teen. I still don't know. I kind of know clouds, but I don't. You can name all the clouds then when you were in grade school.
Yeah. Because people would, for birthday presents and things, give me, weather books and all that. So I had it all from a very young age. And then when I applied to undergrad programs, I only applied to schools that had atmospheric science or meteorology as a major. And then it was in college and then in grad school in particular that I moved more to the climate side of things.
Uh-huh. Okay, so, well, that's interesting. I like the idea of a weather station as an 8-year-old, but that would have been pre-digital age, right then? Or were there digital, it would be about that time where digital weather stations were coming out, right?
Yeah, we had, it was a weather station on my roof that had a cord that went into my bedroom, and there was a digital display, but it wasn't, Wi-Fi or anything like that.
Right. So let's jump to the reason I invited you on the podcast, which is you've caused a stir in the climate change world, climate science world, with a paper that you wrote in Nature, and then an article that you published. The paper in Nature was about wildfires and climate. And then on September 5th, you published a piece in the Free Press about your history in publishing academic papers in prestigious journals. I think it might be easiest for me to just read what I think is the nut of that piece so that we set the table here. You wrote, while climate change is an important factor affecting wildfires over many parts of the world, it isn't close to the only factor that deserves our sole focus. So why does the press focus so intently on climate change as the root cause? Perhaps for the same reasons I just did in an academic paper about wildfires in Nature, one of the world's most prestigious journals. It fits a simple storyline that rewards the person telling it. You went on. Climate science has become less about understanding the complexities of the world and more about serving as a kind of Cassandra, urgently warning the public about the dangers of climate change. However understandable this instinct may be, it distorts a great deal of climate science research, misinforms the public, and most importantly, makes practical solutions more difficult to achieve. That you're thrown down the gauntlet here. I mean, you're kind of attacking the climate catastrophism business, and I think it's clear it is something of it is a business. But in reading your follow-up to this, this is something you've been thinking about for quite a long time.
Yeah, and I use the word narrative in the piece, and I think that that's kind of the right way to think about it. That there's really like a dominant kind of narrative of climate science that's I think penetrated into a lot of institutions, universities, and as well as these high impact journals. And that kind of dominant or preferred narrative is essentially that, the impacts of climate change on people are catastrophic and pervasive, and, kind of implicitly it's implied that they're larger than a bunch of other things that are going on. And then the way to address those impacts is through greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And, a lot of times that's then wrapped into like a goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So kind of a massive immediate transformation of the global energy and agricultural system that you can kind of justify at any cost if the impacts are large enough. And so I think that narrative really leaves out the full picture, or, the full truth on what's going on. And so that's kind of what my essay is about, is that these preferred narratives can get entrenched by institutions and kind of within scientific fields, because you kind of, as a researcher, you see a certain narrative, and then you that indirectly kind of solicits more research from other researchers that are going to be along those same lines. And then I specifically targeted my own paper where I was basically describing a situation where, as a researcher doing research on wildfire activity, you have to publish, and you have to, you're publishing papers as essentially your progress reports on the research that you're doing. So you have to get papers out. And I noticed that there was an opportunity for a high impact paper, a paper that I thought, would be publishable by Science or Nature or one of these high impact journals. And there's just a lot of incentives for researchers to publish in these journals. It gets a ton of media coverage, which gets it in front of the eyes of a bunch of other researchers, which means that you're going to be cited more. So citations and high impact publications are a very big deal for researchers. So I described a situation where I essentially played into what I thought would result in a high impact paper. So that's largely around the framing of the research question, being kind of exclusively looking at the climate change impact, even though we know that there's a bunch of other causal factors going on. And that's all, by the way, that's all laid out and totally, legitimately laid out in the paper. So the paper can be taken completely at face value. It's just that the formation of the research question itself, I, in retrospect, decided that was not actually the most useful, use of my time, and that it would be better, more informative, more useful for society to be thinking about climate change much more in the context of many other causal factors, and in particular it's the change in vegetation and fuel loads that are the most relevant for wildfires.
Well, and that was clearly the case in Maui, wasn't it? I mean, you wrote this paper and it was already under review before the Maui wildfire. So you kind of got a double hit here, right? In terms of the timing and the news cycle, that it came out right after the Maui fires. And that was clear in the news reporting that I've seen, that a lot of this was due to excessive vegetation growth, that there was a lot of dry grassland around that hadn't been tended, and that that was one of the key, as you say, fuel loading. So you kind of got well, I'll ask it. Did that timing really was good for you in terms of getting attention on the paper? No.
Yeah, I mean, just a total coincidence. And the situation in Maui is pretty different than in California, where in California, I'm talking about this situation where we had this ill-advised policies of fire suppression, right, which caused large, buildup of hazardous fuels over the past century in a lot of California's forests. So where there used to be a situation where you'd have a natural fire every about 10 years, would clear that out. Now we have a situation where we've built up fuels for an entire century, and so you have way more to burn when there is a fire, making it much more intense. And that's different than what happened in Maui, which is these invasive grasses that took over after the shutdown of various
it was cattle grazing, wasn't it?
Yeah, and sugarcane and pineapple. But still, I mean, the point there is that a lot of the media did focus on some climate change aspect of that, looking at flash droughts or things like that, when I really don't think it should get central billing in that case at all. Really, it's this kind of inordinate focus on a climate change impact that I don't think is necessary or springs from the science.
So is it fair to say then what you did was to adhere to the narrative, this narrative that you said, this dominant narrative on climate change about that impacts are catastrophic and pervasive? So here's how it will tell me if I'm reading back this confessional, I guess is a way to put it. I mean, is that the right word?
Yeah, I definitely feel guilty in retrospect, playing into that. And so
but I'm sorry to interrupt, but playing into that is that you adhered to the narrative, knowing that you get this published in a prestigious journal, but you purposely omitted some of the facts, right? And now in your confession, you're saying, well, I'm coming clean here. I didn't, if we're going to have a more honest, is this a fair readback? If we're going to be more honest, we have to be, the climate scientists have to be more open and more, include more, disclose more complexity, disclose more that this is not a simple narrative. Boil it down for me. What needs to happen here?
Yeah, so it's not that anything was omitted in the paper itself. So again, the paper itself is just, you can take it completely at face value, because it says that the research question is, we are going to focus narrowly on the impact of climate change on wildfire, the risk of extreme daily growth in wildfires. And there's a lot of really interesting scientific results in there that do have a lot of value. But what I'm saying is that, that then that's a Nature paper. So that gets, Nature has a direct line to the media, where they're given these stories, these papers, a week ahead of time. The media gets them a week ahead of time and is able to write their stories. And there's kind of a big, the embargo is lifted and it's dropped, and then all the stories go out and everything. And at the end of the day, what the public hears is not the full story, right? Because it's just, this is another paper, I'm saying, that's along these same lines of focusing narrowly on a negative climate change impact. And it says that all in the paper, but then what the public is hearing is these constant just accumulation of this same type of paper that's not discussing other important factors. And so then that's where the full story is left out, I think. And I think that that's, kind of penetrated the zeitgeist of a lot of the public, that this kind of climate is everything, negative impact story. And especially, left of center kind of educated circles that have a lot of influence on policy, for example. And so I'm very worried about people just being kind of misled from the aggregate output of the field, the aggregate output of climate science, when it has such a narrow focus on seeking out and highlighting negative impacts from climate change and not really putting them in proper context, in my opinion.
So this is what you later wrote, not in your free press piece, but in a piece that you published on the Breakthrough Institute's website, which is thebreakthrough.org. You said, I chose to frame the research question in my paper narrowly to focus only on the contribution that climate change was making to wildfire behavior. In doing so, I'm just repeating largely what you just said, but I think it's good to, the way you wrote it, I think is very succinct as well. In doing so, my methodology left out, held constant, the myriad of causal factors that affect wildfire behavior, e.g. non-climate factors like human ignition patterns and fuel loads, and could be altered in the future to mitigate wildfire danger. The paper is honest, you put in italics, about leaving those factors out. So there's nothing explicitly wrong with the paper itself. However, at the end of the day, what gets communicated to the public is just part of the story and not the full truth, you put in italics. So, but this climate industrial complex, there's a lot of money at stake here. It's not just the climate for the climate scientists themselves, right? It's also for the mitigation, right? That if there is catastrophe looming, that no cost is too high. Of course, we have to subsidize wind, solar, batteries, hydrogen, and they're now, if you look at the potential costs of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're talking trillions of dollars, potentially, of federal money at stake here that hinges on, is it fair to say that hinges on this catastrophic narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I just want the public decisions on legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act to be as informed as possible. And so if people are not getting the full picture, the full truth on all of these, multi-causal factors and, really how big the climate change signal is on these various impacts on society. So it's not just, wildfires, but talking about effects on food or agriculture or, human health, non-optimal temperature related deaths, or, exposure to flooding, or all of these things, the trends, if you just look at the overall trends, they're positive, they're good. But then there's a lot of research going in and teasing out and looking for the climate change impact in there and saying, well, the trends in agriculture, yes, we've seen these huge increases in yields, but they wouldn't have been quite as large. The increases would not have been quite as large if it weren't for climate change. And that's all, said in the reports. But I don't think that's what people hear. I think that people, hear something that's much more dire and much more negative. And so, yeah, when policies are enacted, people should be fully aware of what the actual magnitude of the impact is, and not just isolating the magnitude from climate change, the magnitude of the impact from climate change, but putting it in the context of everything else that's going on.
But that's the nut of it, isn't it? I mean, I had Judith Curry, who I'm sure you're familiar with her work. I had her on the podcast fairly recently. She said that we need to see the global climate as, here's her quote, a complex, chaotic, nonlinear system. You agree with that?
Yeah, I think I am much more confident in the basic physical climate science than I perceive Dr. Curry is. So I think it's beyond any reasonable doubt that humans are responsible for the vast majority, if not 100% of the increase in temperature since the Industrial Revolution. So I think the evidence is very, very solid on that. What I'm more concerned about is not really the complexity of the climate system, it's the complexity of the interaction of the climate system with society, and how, if you look historically, all of the measures of human well-being that should be sensitive to climate have all been going in positive direction. Say over the past 50 years, it's warmed 1 degree Celsius. We've seen, crop yields and calories per person increase, death rates from malnutrition and famines decrease, the share of population with safe drinking water is increased, livable land area in coastal cities has increased,
Right.
because you do land reclamation. So all of these things are going in the positive direction. And then we're expecting another 1 to 1.25 degrees Celsius warming in the next 50 years. And there's every reason to believe that they will still be going in the positive direction despite that. And so those interactions, I think, are not getting proper billing here. And that's the complexity that should be highlighted in when policy decisions are coming up.
So, okay, well, let me come back to that in just a second. Again, my guest is Patrick T. Brown. He's the co-director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Breakthrough Institute. You can find more about him at thebreakthrough.org. He's on Twitter at Patrick T. Brown 31. When you read that back, so what I'm hearing you say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that yes, the climate is changing, but we're not seeing catastrophic impacts, or at least we're not seeing catastrophic impacts yet. Because of all those things you just said, because this is kind of one of the points of eco-modernism, right? With the Breakthrough Institute in general, right? That things are getting better. People are living longer, healthier, freer lives than any time in human history. And so you're not saying climate change is not a concern, but what are you said humans are responsible, but finish that off for me. What are you saying then? That we need to balance these discussions more carefully?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, the thing with CO2, the problem with CO2 is that it accumulates in the atmosphere. And so it is the case that in order to stabilize climate, in order to stabilize the temperature, doesn't mean bring it back down to where it was, but just stop it from warming. You do need to get emissions down to zero, to net zero of CO2. And so that is something that has to be a long-term goal, or you just warm indefinitely. And so I am definitely on board with policies that put pressure in that direction. And I'm not an energy policy expert. My colleague Sieber is much more of an expert on that side of things. But given that that's the situation, so we do have to reduce emissions to zero in the long term. It's a matter of how fast you need to do that. And that's informed by how big the impacts are. And I do think that in a lot of cases, the impacts are being oversold as being larger than they actually are, if you look at the data. So just kind of going back to the narrative idea, the narrative that I've said has kind of taken hold is that, the impacts are very large when you just focus on them. And the primary way to deal with them is through greenhouse gas emissions reductions. But you could have like a different narrative that's basically like, that leans in a little bit more to human resilience to climate. So you could say something like, okay, society is slowly starting to decarbonize. We're probably going to be at a plateau of emissions for a long time. And it's going to result, we've seen a little bit over 1 degree Celsius warming. We'll probably, at the end of the day, in the 2100s, be closer to 3 degrees Celsius of warming. Given that, here's what we have to do to deal with the impacts that would come from 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warming. So that could be a way that papers are framed. And that would be, to me, I think that's a more useful way of framing papers, because it highlights what you would need to do to overcome the climate change impact and it's much more, focused. It's much more positive and focused on the ground, near-term practical solutions, as opposed to saying our only lever is climate policy. Our only lever is mitigation, greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And I don't think that's, when you look at the difference in 2050, for example, between, say, an RCP 4.5 and RCP 2.6, those are huge policy differences, but they make almost no difference in climate by 2050. So any type of problem that you're trying to solve on the ground needs to look elsewhere. It needs to look, at that problem in particular, and focus on that on the ground.
So is it fair to read back what you just said, is that mitigation is part of it, but as I look at what's going on around the world, I don't see much, real traction in terms of mitigation. So is it fair to say, or to paraphrase back to you, that we need to be thinking more about adaptation?
Yeah, and I think it's just more fostering continued resilience increase. So historically, you look at all those positive trends in all our climate sensitive portions of society. This didn't come about because we said in 1900, the climate is going to change, and so we need to adapt to climate change. Like, that makes it seem like we had everything figured out perfectly, and then the only reason to worry about the climate is because it's changing. But that's not what happened. We've just, through economic development, we've drastically increased our resilience to the climate which is naturally hostile to people, and that we need to, be facilitating more of that. So, that could be more of an emphasis on agriculture R&D, or it could be that you get, in addition to an electric vehicle subsidy, maybe a big subsidy on air conditioning, something like that. So more of an emphasis on this resilience could push in that direction, and result in helping people more, frankly, just in the near term, people alive today, right now.
Well, so fair enough. I like that. Well, I use that term resilience because I think that's right. If we need our systems to be weather resilient, weather independent, and not weather dependent, which is one of the big mistakes I think is being made now, that we're adding a whole lot of, or spending a whole lot of money on systems that are weather dependent and not weather resilient. So you said you're not an energy policy expert necessarily, but then what is the way forward then? What do you give me? If I just made you the Secretary of Energy or the energy czar, what would you do? What are the policies that you would push then on the we've talked about adaptation and resilience, that is going to be naturally ongoing. You mentioned ag and research in ag. What about policy on the energy and power front? What would you do?
Well, I think just broadly that it should focus on research and development, that it should, rather than restrictions, rather than putting, banning things or restricting anything that's going to restrict energy access or make things more expensive, I think is a non-starter politically, and it's, has real implications on people's lives, right? So the increases in resilience that I'm talking about largely come from fossil fuel development, economic development. And so you have to be very careful with anything that's going to restrict your energy options. And so I do think that the way to go is to be much more on the side of, research and development that lowers the cost of alternatives to energy systems that emit CO2 as a byproduct, and so makes them desirable on their own. It makes them desirable over fossil fuels without even considering the climate change impact.
So, to use what I think is terminology that Ted Nordhaus and I think Michael Schellenberger have used, is both, and others, is make a cleaner energy cheaper.
Right, exactly.
So you have a stance on nuclear?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it certainly has. There's a lot of bugaboos on nuclear that I don't think are justified, and so I certainly think that nuclear should be a major portion of our energy mix going forward. When you take into account all the costs and benefits of different energy systems, which I think is very, very important and is often neglected in this conversation, that there's what I see is kind of so much cheerleading for renewable energy, wind and solar in particular, that there's just not really an acknowledgement of what you do with the waste and what you do with the supply chain issues and how you deal with all of the additional land that comes with that. And so those things need to be taken into account along with the costs and benefits of nuclear and the costs and benefits of fossil fuels. And it should just be, looking at all sides of the ledger when you're making these energy policy decisions.
Fair enough. So going back to your paper and to the article you wrote in the Free Press, one of the things I heard you say that you felt constrained in being in academia, and that was why you went to the think tank world. Is this, I've said the word confession before, is this paper going to, if you wanted to go back to academia, is going to hurt your prospects there? I mean, have you committed some kind of career Harry Carey here? How do you think about where you go from here?
Yeah, I think it definitely hurts my prospects of going back to academia, but I have no plans of doing that. So I'm not too concerned about that. But yeah, there's there's kind of cliques and clubs in academia, and that's something that I'm trying to highlight actually as kind of the social construction of these narratives and about research that's kind of good and research that everyone likes, that affects the output of fields, these social relationships. And so being transgressive in that way can be not fun socially. And I think it's important for people to know that dynamic, that kind of social dynamic within academia, actually affects the public knowledge generation. It affects the output of fields.
Well, so that cliques and clubs, and now so you're outside the cliques and the clubs then, as what has been the cliques and clubs that are following this narrative that you talked about, that the narrative must be adhered to, and now you're a transgressor, you're a heretic in this regard, and that you've called out this hewing to the narrative, right? Towing the line. You're saying, well, no, everyone's towing the line for a reason. The more you toe the line, the more research grants you get, the more catastrophic the outcome, the more money you get, that this is part of, my friend Chuck Spinney called it the self-licking ice cream cone, right? You get the same kind of reinforcing effects, and now you've stepped outside of that. So now this kind of is this a career defining moment for you?
I don't know. Possibly. We'll see what happens. But I would say that I don't think it's that cynical the way that you just described it, that people are doing it just for career grants or for money or things like that. I think it's much more subtle. It's much more just embedded within the culture. And I think people are genuine in the way that they think about the climate change issue. So I'm not questioning people's motives. I'm just arguing for an alternative narrative. And I think that people that are particularly offended by an alternative narrative really like this idea of the science says, like capital S science, and then they defend basically their opinions under this mantle of the science says. It's this kind of nice bludgeon to use to defeat your opponents. That what I think is a fact that's based on capital S science, and so challenging that, saying that no, this is actually there's this fair element of this that is kind of socially constructed and is not doesn't just spring from the underlying data. That's very offensive to people that like to think of what their opinion is as a fact that cannot be questioned.
So the gospel is the gospel, and it must not be questioned. That you have to hew to that line, right? And that so you're okay. So I take your point. It's more subtle than what there. Is it
Yeah,
fair
and
to
I
say
would
to
say,
read
and
back? Go ahead.
I'll also say that I wouldn't say that you have to hew to it. It's just that it's kind of the highest return on investment for a researcher to hew on it, to stick to that. And there's thousands of papers published every day, and there's tons of journals, and there's a lot of research out there that's in the direction of exactly what I'm advocating for, which is the reason that I know that a lot of these increases in resilience exist is because those papers exist. But what I'm saying is that kind of at the elite institutions at the highest level, where you get where you're looking for the high impact publications, and you're looking for the glowing media coverage, that's the section of climate science that I'm talking about, that it seems particularly married to this kind of climate doom narrative.
Right. Yeah. I like that idea, the climate doom narrative. But it's interesting the way you framed it. You said the return on investment. So I'd even use an energy or physics term: energy return on energy invested. If you're going to spend all this time doing this paper, you're going to get a bigger return on your energy invested if you adhere to this climate doom narrative than to one that is more well-rounded. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That it's that what I thought when I was doing the research was, the most useful way to frame this research in terms of how it could be used by society, by the public, would be to properly place the climate change signal within the signal of changes in fuel loads, and then look at how proposed policies going forward could potentially offset, or how much they could offset the climate change impact going forward in terms of reducing fuels and negating that climate change impact. And so that, however, more useful research would be just kind of more boring. It's not as clean of a story. You're gonna have more equivocation in your results, and so that's kind of a problem that I'm identifying, is that that more useful research is less clean of a story. It's less.
It's more nuanced.
Yeah, you're not able to. If you look at the titles of these high impact papers, they're like headlines, like newspaper headlines.
Yeah.
That climate warming does this bad thing. Climate change does this bad thing. And the alternative paper that I'm saying is more useful would be a much more a much less direct title, and it would just be something that I envision would not be a high impact paper. And so that gap between what's most useful versus what's most useful for society versus what's most useful for the career of the researcher, that's the gap that I think we can try to close as a community.
Got it. So if I was going to put it in newspaper terms, and that's been my career, right? I've been a reporter my whole life. I've never had a real job. If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've thought about that exact same thing a lot. That it's not it's not uncommon to criticize the media for hyperbole, right? But I'm bringing it back one step to the underlying publications, and I definitely see a huge it leads attractor for the underlying publications. And just to give people an idea of kind of the realm of science that I'm talking about, I think there's certain parts of science more on the physical science side, where you don't have the creativity and freedom to kind of decide your research question and inform your paper with just a lot of creativity. But in the interaction between climate and society, you do have that creativity. There's just a ton of researcher degrees of freedom, and there's a ton of freedom in terms of how you ask a research question and what you're deciding to look at. And so that's how you can that's how social forces can shape what comes out of a research field. So it's different than if you're looking at like hypothesis tests, like double blind control studies or something like that. You're just asking a question: is a drug efficacious? And we're gonna run the study and find out whether or not it's efficacious. That's not really what's going on in the type of scientific publication that I'm talking about, which is much more data analysis and much more, you spend years kind of tweaking your research question and being creative essentially about how your paper
is that merely a function? Well, not merely, but is it a function of the fact that there's so many variables in climate science that you can accentuate with this versus that? Whereas in chemistry, if you're making a new compound, people can go back and test that. Well, you made that compound, and you can write a new journal article about this compound that does X, Y, and Z. But is that a fair way to think about it? You're very constrained. If my father-in-law was a chemist at University of Michigan. He's an emeritus now, but that's what immediately comes to mind. If you're going to claim you have a new polymer, and that was one of new better battery chemistry, other people can go back and test that right away. Whereas in climate, not so much.
Yeah, definitely. And what is produced is, I would say they're just one volley in a whole tennis match or something like that, like each paper. And that's how other researchers think of them. But then if that's the case, then I don't think we should necessarily have this straight to public consumption pipeline where you publish a paper and then everyone, then that's pushed to the media and then people are writing a story on it all over the place. When to other researchers, you just look at that and you're like, okay, that's interesting opinion by that person. That's kind of like how you think of it within a lab setting where we have things called, journal clubs, which that doesn't mean you go write in your diary. It means you read a research article and discuss it in academic labs. And in those situations, people are very, they roll their eyes at papers. Oh, they looked at this. Why didn't they look at it this way? Oh, it's because it gave them this answer that they probably wanted. That's kind of the culture that I'm coming out of.
I got you.
So I think that it's a lot of people are kind of taken aback by, you're challenging a published research paper. Like, that's crazy. And it's just, that's not how people within the field think of these research papers. They think of them as just single data points in the whole
right.
In
the quest to better understand this complex system.
Right.
So whose work do you admire in this field? Who do you follow? Who are your North Stars?
You put me on the spot. I don't know if I want to name names necessarily.
Okay, fair enough.
But I try to stick to the less flashy journals and the more disciplinary journals when it comes to understanding interactions between climate and society.
Okay. But I would say if you quit academia and have no intention of going back, you find that you have more freedom in Breakthrough Institute, the think tank world, than you would have in academia. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's more that I don't feel pressure to publish papers or high impact papers in particular. So that's what I'm highlighting, is that you can do research in whatever direction you want and not feel like, the clock's ticking. I need another publication, and I need the publication to attract citations.
You need it to be prestigious. It has to be some high profile outlet. Right. So just a couple more questions. We've been talking about 45 minutes, and I think we covered pretty much the things that we had outlined and talked about. I ask all of my guests, what are you reading? I'm sure you're reading all the time. Are you like novels? You fiction, nonfiction guy? What are the books that are I see a bunch of books behind you there. Tell us what you're reading.
Yeah, mostly journal papers and textbooks. I do not read fiction at all. I have a 2.5-year-old. I used to read a lot more before I had a 2.5-year-old, so read more nonfiction books. haven't.
So you're reading Hop on Pop and Dr. Seuss is what you're telling me.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
I'll tell you, I mean, two of my favorite books, nonfiction books, are The Righteous Mind by John Haidt and The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb.
Right.
And both of those are, talk a lot about kind of human biases and human the ways that we can fool ourselves. And so that's something that I think is a theme of some of this work.
Gotcha. So you've been through, I mean, as I understand it, you've had back and forth with the Nature editor. There was talk about withdrawing the paper. You've been in the middle of this kind of controversy now for a while, for several weeks anyway. And you've talked about what I would say is I don't know if it's the dark side, but an unfortunate narrative that dominates. What gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is just looking at the difference between what is reported out there, which, so I've had like a Google News alert on climate change for 10 years. I read these journals. I read what comes out of the climate desks. And that story is so much more pessimistic than when I look at the data or look at, what's been going on historically in terms of climate sensitive aspects of society and how they've overcome any negative impact from climate change. And so knowing that makes me much more optimistic about the future than most of my contemporaries who are not climate scientists, but kind of adjacent to the climate area. And so I think that that's something that we can lean into more, and we can try to facilitate more increases in resilience. And I think that that's a hopeful message.
So if I'm going to read that back, you're saying that when you look at the world, the situation isn't as dire as we're being told. Is that a fair way to?
Certainly, yeah.
Okay. Well, I like that message. I'm as the late Molly Ivins said, optimistic to the point of idiocy. So I'm an optimist as well. Patrick Brown, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Congratulations on stirring the pot. As another Texas writer, Jim Hightower, said some time ago, it's the agitator that gets the clothes clean. So you've definitely done some agitation here. So good for you.
Yeah. Yep. That's for sure.
My guest has been Patrick T. Brown. He's the co-director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Breakthrough Institute. You can find him at thebreakthrough.org and on Twitter at Patrick T. Brown 31. Patrick, thanks again for coming on the Power Hungry podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And all you out there in podcast land, tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. It might be as good as this one. Until then, see ya.